Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mindy Romero, and I direct the California Civic Engagement Project, which is a research center at the USC Price School of Public Policy. I want to thank, before we jump in, thank the Price School and everyone, oh, there we go, in the chat as well. Harley and Jonathan and the full team for their assistance in putting on this talk, as always. So thank you very much. And also Katie, who's with us as well. I'm going to talk to you about turnout, voter turnout, specifically in the 2020 primary election here in California. That was March 3rd of this year, if you weren't aware of the date. I'm going to go ahead and in a moment here share my PowerPoint, but certainly you can adjust your screen. I think you might still be able to see me even with the PowerPoint. Before we jump into that, I want to let everybody know that we have a chat. In the chat, the questions are going to be moderated at the end of the talk today, but we have placed a link to the fact sheet that goes along with this talk. So most of the data that I'm covering is available in a fact sheet from my research center. You can see the link there. And if you click on that link, there's also the availability of at least much of the data by county as well. So I'm going to go over kind of, for the most part, state level numbers, but you can get individual county level data also if you're interested. So let me go ahead and share my screen. So we're going to talk about what happened in the 2020 primary. I'm going to give somewhat of a county breakdown, at least in terms of the top performing counties. Again, more detailed data is available on that link that's in the chat. And then we'll round out talking about what to expect in November. So there's a lot we could talk about. I'll leave, the era of COVID and how elections are actually going to be put on. I'll leave that towards the end of the talk. I want to just kind of set the stage and talk about what the focus is today, which is the primary itself, and what we learned about turnout and specifically representation in that election. So just briefly to let you know, in terms of our methodology, our voter turnout data, these are actual voter records supplied by the statewide database by Political Data Incorporated for 2020. When I talk about eligible turnout or eligible population data, those are data from the California Department of Finance. I'm happy to take any questions on all of that in the Q&A. So what happened in the 2020 primary here in California in terms of turnout? So if I just ask that question of all of you, some of you may have been following the Secretary of State's numbers that have been put out. But of course, those numbers are very valuable and needed and required by law to be posted. But those just give you the turnout for the general population. We do not have official sources that give us turnout by age, by race, ethnicity, by other subgroups. That is up to researchers to be able to break that out. And I'm going to break out some of that for you today. So in terms of the eligible turnout, in California, it was 37.3%. Now, let me define eligible. So that is the turnout of the adult citizens, the population that's eligible to vote, whether they're registered or not, just eligible to vote in California. It's a standard measure. The official numbers from the Secretary of State, just to note, are just a little bit over 38%. For our research, we're going to stick with our numbers and compare across groups. You have to have, of course, the same methodology, the same data sources to be able to do that. So total eligible turnout from our research, 37.3%. That was an increase, up nearly 4 percentage points from the 2016 primary, and historically not a record, but a very high turnout year for a primary presidential year. But let's talk about subgroups. So yes, it was a good turnout at 4% for everybody as a general eligible electorate, but what was it for Latino eligible turnout? Again, here's the percent of Latinos that are eligible to vote in the primary. What percent actually turned out to vote? 22.9%. So we know there's always a disparity. Turnout is always lower in primaries. This was a good year for a turnout of a primary election for the general electorate. When we talk about race ethnicity, we always know that there are disparities quite significant, as you know, 37 in this case, right, to 22 for Latinos specifically. We always know that is present. But typically when we see a good year for turnout, where we see an uptick as we did in the overall turnout rate, that means that that's also good for subgroups. So our underrepresented groups become a little less underrepresented. The gap in turnout rates between Latinos in the general elected or Asian Americans in the general elected, where we have data African Americans in the general electorate, usually decreases. However, in this election, that wasn't the case. So turnout for Latinos was 22.9%. That was just about a half a percentage point lower than their turnout in the 2016 presidential primary, the most recent comparable election. So it went up for everybody by almost 4%, but for percentage points, excuse me, but went down just slightly for Latinos. That was not something we were expecting. For Asian Americans, their turnout was 21.8% eligible turnout in the primary. This actually was an increase of almost 3 percentage points. That's a good thing. But the increase for Asian Americans was not at the same rate as it was for the overall general electorate, as I said, nearly 4 percentage points. For this particular study, we do not have data for African Americans or whites. But what I can tell you, if you're interested in just the kind of everybody not Latino and not Asian American, so the non-Latino, non-Asian American, that's sometimes a group that we use for analysis, that was much higher. That rate was 49%, up from 42% in the 2016 primary, presidential primary. So for non-Latino, non-Asians as a group, which in a state like California is mostly white, it's about 86, 87% white, they saw quite a jump, a 7 percentage point jump in their turnout. The overall electorate, again, saw about a 4 percentage point increase. Latinos saw a half percentage point decrease, and Asian Americans saw an increase of about 3 percentage points. So let me just show you, visualize everything I just said. This chart doesn't have non-Latino, non-Asian, but it just kind of gives you a really simple breakout. If you look here, if you can see my cursor on the screen, that 2020 election, that blue bar is everybody, the general electorate, that number I gave you, 37.3%. Latino is 22.9%, that number I gave you, 21.8% in green for Asian Americans. And then if we hop over here, follow my cursor to the most recent comparable election, again, presidential to presidential, primary to primary, we can see the differences, right, for Latinos and Asian Americans and the change over time that I just covered. What you also notice here, just historically going back to 2010, is again, those disparities, as I mentioned, are always present by race, ethnicity, always present, and also present for African Americans. We just don't have those data for right now. The question is just how big are the disparities? Do they narrow a little bit or do they widen a little bit in an election? And in this election, at least for Latinos and Asian Americans both, it widened compared to the general electorate, compared to everybody else. The share of the primary vote. So disparities in turnout, differences in turnout rates means that groups are a different share of those actually voting. So if they have a higher turnout rate, it gives them a greater share of those actually casting a ballot, whether it's high turnout year or low turnout year. So Latinos and Asian Americans continue, based on the primary, to be underrepresented in California's electorate. So what do I mean by that? I'm talking numerically underrepresented. For a group to be numerically represented, their share of the eligible voter population should be about the same, that percent, as their share of all voters in an election. In the 2020 primary, you can see that Latinos made up 30%, well, almost 31% of the eligible voter population. I'll show you in a minute in the next slide that they were only 19% of actual voters, so 31% to 19%. That's a huge gap, that's underrepresentation. Asian Americans were 14.6% of the eligible voter population, but they were also a much lower share, and let me just visualize this. So here's the 2020 March primary. So the differences in turnout rates, this is now their share of actual voters, right, in the pie of actual voters. So disparities in turnout make for a difference, right, or at least impact the share of the vote. So here's that share for Latinos. 19% of all voters in the primary were Latino. Again, but Latinos are 31% of the eligible voter population. That is quite a big gap, consistent with what we've seen over time, but actually widening here in the primary. Asian Americans, 8.6% of all voters, when they're, again, nearly 15% of the eligible voter population. We can see, if my cursor is not showing up very well, but if you can see, comparing to the June 2016 primary, Latinos were 19%. They were 19.8% in the June primary. So they lost ground a little bit in terms of their share of the vote, even though their percentage of the population has been increasing and the overall population numbers have been increasing. And Asian Americans gained from 7.1% to 8.6% in their share of the vote. But perhaps we might have expected a greater share if their turnout had kept in pace with the general population. Hopefully that makes sense in a short amount of time. So let's talk about youth, another historically underrepresented group. For our study, for most of our research at the California Civic Engagement Project, we define youth as age 18 to 24. So what was the eligible turnout rate of youth age 18 to 24, again, citizens of that age? 16.1%. So again, of all youth, 3 million plus in California that are citizens that are eligible to vote, 16.1% actually turned out to vote in the primary. Now let's talk about representation. Well, actually, I'll do that in just a moment. The kicker here for young people is their turnout, like Latinos. I said it went down for Latinos about 0.5 percentage point. Youth turnout went down about 1 percentage point compared to the most recent comparable election, right, 2016 presidential primary. So there was an expectation, I think particularly for young people, that we might see an increase, that if we saw an overall increase, which there was a lot of expectation for that we'd also see an overall increase for young people in their turnout in the primary, historically speaking. And instead, we actually saw a decrease. There were certainly pockets across the state where young people had an increase, but overall, there was a decrease for the state as a whole. So this chart here, if you can see the title, California Eligible Voter Turnout, this is for, and the legend is hidden just a bit, so forgive me, but the red bar is for everybody. That's the total eligible turnout, and the blue bar is for young people age 18 to 24. So again, that 37% eligible turnout that I showed you before, this is a 16.1% for young people. We're just going to hop over to the most recent comparable election, 2016 primary, and you can see 17.1%, right? So everybody increased, but young people decreased. They did increase over the midterm primary, that we would expect, but in comparing across presidential primaries, we saw a small decrease. So now we'll talk about representation. So in their share of actual voters, so disparities in turnout. Actually, let me just mention one other thing here. So I said youth turnout was, 16.1%. If we just look at older voters, 65 plus, so their turnout was 56%, their eligible voter turnout. So young people age 18 to 24, 16%, those 65 plus, 56%, 40 percentage points difference between older versus younger, right? That is unfortunately consistent historically. The question is just how much of a difference. We know in any given election, younger people usually have turnout 20, 30, 40 percentage points lower. In this primary, it was 40 percentage points lower than older voters. The youth share of total voters, so now disparities in turnout impact the share a group has of the actual pie of voters in an election. So their share also went down from 2016 to 2020. I'll show you that chart in a moment, but youth were 6.3% of all voters in the 2020 primary. But as you can see here on the last line, bullet pointed line, they're 14.5% of the eligible voter population. So they're 14.5, if they're numerically represented, they should be about 14.5% of all voters. Instead, they were 6.3. So this chart here just shows you their share of the vote over time, back to 2004, They lost ground in 2016. Still historically, 6.3 is a good number, and compared to what we usually see for their share of the vote, but they did lose ground from 2016. And again, no matter what, the election year we're talking about, they're always underrepresented numerically compared to their share of the eligible voter population, right? A huge challenge for young people in terms of their voice electorally. And by the way, as I move on to counties, I'm hoping in the Q&A I get questions around this, but there are real reasons why we see these disparities, right? By race, ethnicity, by age. And we do a lot of research around this, of course, certainly at my research center. Very significant barriers to why groups have lower turnout rates. I want to make sure that that's understood. These numbers are not to emphasize or to excuse the low turnout numbers. These numbers are to say that these groups, we hope at least, highlight the importance of supporting historically underrepresented groups in their quest for a larger voice in our electorate. Real barriers that still impact their turnout and their representation, in other words. So if we look at county, here just for simplicity for today, I'm just showing you the top 5 counties, the counties with the highest overall total eligible voter turnout or general eligible voter turnout. So if you can see my cursor, just go to the far left, you see the county name. The second column is total eligible voter turnout. That's their actual turnout. And then the third column shows their, and it says CD, sorry, that should be CT, but county. their total county rank. So Marin had the highest eligible voter turnout. So for the state, remember, it was 37.2. You can see it down here at the bottom. Let me see if I can get rid of these pictures. There we go, a little bit better. Oh, well, they still pop up. One moment. Hide them a little better at least. Okay, and then if we come over here, we can see that the state average, state total was 37.2, but for Marin it was 61.6, right? There are significant differences across the state in their eligible voter turnout rates. Marin had the highest, that's why they're ranked first here. Nevada had the second highest, they were 57.3. Third was Sierra, fourth, Santa Cruz, fifth, Alpine. And then if you're curious, we're at Los Angeles County, because I know I have a lot of Trojans on the line, on Zoom, I can't say on the line. And I should have welcomed, by the way, we have a lot of folks on Zoom, but we have, my understanding is many more live on our Facebook Live channel. So hi to all of you. 45th was where Los Angeles ranked for its overall total eligible voter turnout. So it's marked in red, if you can see my cursor, simply because it is below the state average. And of course, Los Angeles pulls down, so to speak, forgive the phrasing, the overall state average because it's about a quarter of the state's voters, or at least eligible voters, or registered voters. Now here for Latino eligible voter turnout for those same counties that ranked 1 through 5, now we're just going to show you what the Latino turnout was and the ranking amongst counties for Latino turnout. So Marin was number one overall. For Latinos, their eligible voter turnout was 31%, right? So 61 for everybody in Marin, 31% for Latinos, and for Latino turnout across all counties, Marin actually ranked number 3rd. Hope that makes sense. And we're going to make these slides available so you can take your time to kind of look through all of this. For Asian American, it was 37.6, so 11th. So for Nevada, again, so ranked 2nd. Just going to explain this. I'm not going to go through all these numbers. But again, the difference between 57.3 for everybody, Latino was 25, ranked 19th for Latino turnout amongst counties. Asian American was 37.8, right? Again, it's still a significant difference, and 10th. If we go all the way down here for Los Angeles, and if you can see, maybe you can't see, Los Angeles is 23.3% for Latino EVT, ranked 28th amongst counties, so better in that sense than the overall turnout. And then Asian Americans was 20.1%, 40th. So I'm going to move on. Now, one of the ways to really gauge kind of improvement over time is to look at the difference between comparable elections, their overall increase or their decrease. So many counties that have, like I said a moment ago in the rankings 1 through 5, many counties that are ranked currently high in the 2020 primary are always ranked high, maybe not always the same exact ranking, but they're always historically higher ranked counties. And counties that have low turnout in 2020 are counties that typically have historically low turnout. So you want to see kind of progress and movement in terms of increases in turnout. So here, this chart is simply showing you, if you look at the third column, and again, this is county, total county rank. So these are the counties with the greatest increase from 2016 to 2020 in their primary turnout, if that makes sense. So Tulare, their turnout was only 21.1, their change in turnout was 22 percentage points. So from 2016 to 2020, they increased 22.1 percentage points. They had the highest increase, right, from those 2 elections of any county in the state. That's what this means, so I just want to explain it to you. Yuba had a 14.7 percentage point increase. They were the 2nd highest increase of any county in the state. Los Angeles actually just slightly declined, basically flat, in their eligible voter turnout, and they ranked 53rd out of 58 counties. So you can look here for Latinos, same things. Latinos, for Tulare, for the top ranked county in terms of change, Latino change in their eligible voter turnout, the change in the Latino eligible voter turnout was 6.8 percentage points. They ranked 21st amongst Latino eligible change by county, and so forth. So I won't go into all this, but I just want you to kind of look at this and know that these charts will be available in the PowerPoint, and you can kind of take your time through that. But to emphasize, when we think about kind of progress and change, we're looking at the one significant way to do that, or common way to do that, is to look, again, change from 2016 to 2020, or any comparable election, and what that difference is. Okay, moving on because of time. So factors in November. So I promised a conversation around this. So Many of you have heard by now, and if you've been on some of my other talks, we know that here in California and across the nation, election officials are really struggling to put on a safe and healthy election. And they are losing their, or at least many cases, losing their voluntary locations, right, where they can actually have a polling place or a vote center. They're losing staff. There's a reduced capacity. And election officials are planning right now for that. There are 2 executive orders that were in place by the governor. One to, in California, send everybody registered in any county a vote by mail ballot, whether they already had that system or not under the Voters' Choice Act. That now has been codified into law under AB 860. So there is a piece of legislation that now requires that every registered voter get a vote by mail ballot sent to them. There's a second executive order that requires, at least gives the option for traditionally polling place counties to opt into a consolidated model. So they now will give or offer a polling place for every 1 in 10,000 registered voters instead of what legally has been required, which is 1 in every 1,000. But if they go to the 1 in 10,000 model, which obviously is much fewer locations, they have to be open 3 days before election day on election day. Happy to take questions. There's also a bill going through the legislature that would codify that executive order. Both executive orders have faced a legal challenge. There is a disagreement in the availability of in-person voting options. That's why we saw some of this legislation and executive orders to make sure that there is consistency across county election offices and how they put on the election. But no matter what, outreach has never been more critical. This is going to be the single biggest change that we think are going to ever see, probably for voters in this state. Voters who are not familiar with vote by mail, of course, we are a high vote by mail use rate, but still many voters that use in-person voting. And just the change itself, right, has to be communicated. And we also know in our state that voters that tend to use, historically underrepresented groups, or at least Latinos and young people and African Americans to some degree as well, use in-person voting options more often. And the outreach to them is going to be even more critical if their polling place has changed or been consolidated, or if they get that vote by mail ballot that they're not familiar with, to make sure that they understand and trust that process if they do want to use that, so they can avoid going in person if they have fear or concern for their health. The last slide here is just to talk about kind of, first off, in the impact before we knew COVID. There was, I think, an expectation by many researchers across the state that we would see higher turnout in November because of the political context that we're in. We've seen higher turnout in 2018 and 2016 and certainly in 2020. Now the question is, will we see that given COVID? Will COVID in some way kind of blunt that turnout? Will it turn off some voters who are fearful of health and safety, not wanting to go in person or not wanting to wait in line? Who might be unfamiliar or uncomfortable with the vote by mail option. Of course, in many jurisdictions across the country, the vote by mail option is still being debated, whether it should be expanded or won't be expanded or as accessible, certainly as it is here in California. In California, it'll be readily available, but still, could we lose some voters who aren't familiar with that process, that want to vote in person, or are fearful of voting in person, or just don't get the message or the memo and don't know where to go on election day? So that's a key concern that advocates are working under. Of course, there could be a mobilization around a reaction to what has happened in terms of how the government has handled COVID-19. We know that is very real. How much that could counter any loss of voting because of COVID, we'll have to see, but I'm deeply concerned about the impact of COVID on potential turnout and if it could potentially turn off people that would have otherwise voted. So outreach is going to be absolutely critical. Education is absolutely critical, and we have very few funds in our state considering the need, right, to meet that massive need. We also have other election reforms at play at the same time. We have same-day voter registration that's available in any polling place across the state and any vote center across the state now, according to new law. We have automatic voter registration, right, registering more people. And then, of course, in any given election, there's the impact of close races, both at the top of the ticket, but down ballot as well. And I'm going to leave it there. Of course, campaigns and candidates always play a role. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. There's my contact information if anybody wants to contact me directly with any questions. I know Harley's going to ask for questions here in the few minutes that we have, and we're happy to get back to you on anything that we can't cover today. You can put it in the Q&A section, and we will get back to you on those questions. let me stop sharing. There I am again. Harley, did you want to moderate any questions we may have?
I did. So thank you all for sending in your great questions. Some of them I will address on here directly. And then Mindy, first question. Are you able to show data about voter turnout based on household income?
It depends on the data source. This particular analysis for the 2020 primary, we are not. No, unfortunately.
Is CCEP funding GOTV efforts by nonprofits?
CCEP is a research center, so we don't fund any efforts, on the ground efforts. Our research is to inform both policy and on the ground efforts, but we put out research and those groups use that work in whatever way that makes sense to them, informing their outreach strategies or just their voter education.
Okay. What is the average low and high percentage of youth participation for counties with a higher racial diversity?
For higher racial, first off, I guess, how do you define higher racial diversity? So maybe that's probably a big question. Happy to get back to you on that. If you could elaborate just a little bit more in the Q&A, I can email you some numbers.
Great. And the last question is, why didn't you track additional races in your study?
Great question. So as I mentioned at the outset, the data source is actual voter records, and we're able to, from the data source, be able to identify, or is able to identify Latinos and Asian Americans, and certainly age because birth date's in the voter file. But we're not able to, for research purposes, kind of reliably identify African Americans and whites. And so that's, something that is always frustrating for us. There are other data sources that, like, for instance, from the census, the current population survey. When those data come out, which are not available for primaries, they're just available for general. But when those data come out, we typically do an analysis so that we are able to look at a broader spectrum by race and ethnicity. So it's just simply that it wasn't available, reliably available in the data source.
Okay, and the last question right now, unless anyone has any others, is do you know any funders who fund GOTV?
Sure. I mean, there are major foundations in California. Like, I don't know what they're currently doing and what their capacity is. Happy to take that offline. I don't want to call out any funders since I don't know what they're doing right now. But if you're an organized effort doing GOTV, you may already be plugged into some of those groups. But and maybe some of your colleagues in the field might be a better resource in terms of connecting to funders and understanding kind of the current foundation landscape, especially in the era of COVID. I know funding dollars are shifting, and that's also really frustrating for public education, public kind of nonpartisan, mobilization efforts that always need more funding.
Well, thank you so much. That was our final question. So like Mindy said, this session will be posted to our website as well as her presentation and links to the study. Thank you all for joining us today. And Mindy?
Oh, I was just going to say, and this is a quick overview study. So certainly when we do additional research on the general, we usually provide a much more detailed analysis by race, ethnicity, but by other groups as well, and by subgroup and geography. So if you want to go to our website, the same link that has the fact sheet, you can kind of play around and look at some of our other publications that some of them have gone into greater depth if you're interested in like historical trends and that sort of thing. Thank you, everyone.